Welcome back. Today we are talking with Dr. Dan Radecki, one of the co-authors of Psychological Safety. Dan, great first segment, lots of good information there. You hinted at this in the first segment, and that is the safety model. And safety is an acronym for some things. Can you tell us what it stands for and all the different pieces?
Yeah, sure. This safety model, think of it as the low-hanging fruit in terms of what our brain needs to feel psychologically safe. Okay. And so based on some of the neuroscience research over the years, these are it's not an exhaustive list, but it is a list of probably the most common needs that our brains have that are wired into our brains. And safety is an acronym. It stands for security, autonomy, fairness, esteem, and trust. Okay. And these are these 5 variables that I mentioned that seem to be important from a neuroscience perspective of how we behave, how we make decisions based on our psychological stress. All right. Now, let me tell you what I mean by that. So, for example, security. Why is that important to our brains? I mentioned our brain is always focused on threat. All right. And that's the way it's wired. Our brain considers the fact that if something isn't certain or consistent, that's very threatening. If you are used to a certain course during your day and it gets sabotaged and now you have to do something different or things are thrown into chaos, that's uncertainty. And that's threatening for your brain because we don't know what that entails. Change is something that's very threatening to our brain. You've probably, as I have, as a leader, been through change management with your people. And it's very difficult. It's not because they want to give you a hard time. It's because probably our brains don't, at the very essence, the very core of our brains don't like change because it's the unknown, right? And it could be threatening. So that's security. Our brains all need security. Question is, how much does your brain need it? Is it more than the next one, autonomy or fairness? Okay. Autonomy is the next variable that we talk about. That's a need that's really critical for our brains to establish psychological safety, a feeling that we're in control. Right? Autonomy is about that, control. And there's some really compelling research showing that if you don't feel you're in control of your life or your situation, you can not only have mental health issues, but physical issues as well. We are starting to see in the field of psychiatry research, things like anxiety and depression are linked to people having the so-called victim mentality, where they don't feel like they're in self-control. All right, so that autonomy is important as well. Fairness, the F. We obviously, through evolution, we've been wired to ensure that we're treated equitably. And so fairness is actually wired into our brain, surprisingly. And we share that. Other species actually have that need for fairness. In fact, when we're not treated fairly, an area of the brain fires that's dedicated to the emotion of disgust. Disgust is this real powerful, visceral emotion. And we feel that sense of disgust when people don't treat us fairly. And so that's another variable that's important for us as humans, to our brains, for psychological safety. And esteem is the E in the model. And that speaks to how we see ourselves, but how we also think others see us. So it's this perception of, do I have a good social standing? That's important for our brains too. We used to think that's a nice to have. We're finding out that need for esteem is wired into our brains. And if you don't have it, in fact, children who are raised with low self-esteem, they tend to have a poorer time managing stress as adults. They tend to be more reactive to stress.
Esteem comes with a bad rep too, though. Right?
It does.
It's just its word because you've got great self-esteem. Oh, you must be a snob or something like that.
Yes. And when we talk about these, we always talk about it. We have this mantra: it's not you, it's your brain. This is what your brain needs. Esteem, yes, it's people equate that with ego and being self-centered, and it's not the case at all. We have to. Our brain is wired to be able to. We want to be in good social standing with those around us. We want to have a good reputation. And that's just something our brain needs. And when you don't have it, it's going to revolt. It's going to be a stressor to you. And then the last one that we talk about is trust. Our brains have a need for trust when we deal with others. And when I say trust, I think of it in the neuroscience sort of perspective of the in-group versus out-group. Trust is about, do I see someone or something that's different, and can I still manage to deal with that person or that thing? So trust is really the brain's in-group versus out-group that I mentioned earlier. And how much do you need that? How much do you need that in-group affiliation? Or are you comfortable with some ambiguity in the people you're dealing with, the situations you're dealing with? So that's the safety model. And what we do is we have an assessment that we use to quantify, based on a 50 question assessment, quantify which of these domains is most important to you on a scale of 0 to 100. And then we talk about this, we debrief it and say, okay, if autonomy is most important to you and you feel that's the lens you see the world through, that's your bias. I need to be in control. And if I'm not in control, I feel a lot of stress. I don't feel psychologically safe. How does that make me come off to other people? How do they see me? And then how can I step back? You mentioned reflecting. How do we reflect on our behaviors and our actions? Reflect on that brain need for autonomy. And what is it? Is it serving me well? Is it causing issues? So this is how we use the model in talking about biases and self-reflection.
And I just want to make sure we say it. The Y in safety stands for you.
It stands for you, and the Y is really the diagnostic piece. Where it sort of can explain why. Let's say, I'll give a good example. I had someone who took the assessment and they found that their highest need for psychological safety was autonomy. It was through the roof. And the Y addresses the possible causes for that. And it's very useful because he said, look, I understand now that I have a high need for autonomy and my team sees me as a micromanager. But I'm not trying, it's not that I don't trust them. I'm not a micromanager. It's just that I grew up as the youngest of 8 children and I never had a say in anything. So as I was growing up, I had this driving need for some type of control or say in my life. And so it's manifest as a leader of micromanaging. And he didn't realize that because it's part of his brain wiring. And when he did, things got a lot better.
I'm curious with these. It's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces of the safety model. Can they all exist at different levels, or do they all have to be even keeled to really make a difference?
No. I think we've done this now. We've given over 10,000 people have taken this assessment. So it's nice to look at the data. They all exist. Look, our brain needs all of these to some extent. And so what we do is we quantify which ones are the highest need, the lowest need, and then we talk about it that way. But they all exist to some extent. And look, the person I gave you an example of for high need autonomy, he was having his autonomy need being met, so he was fine. However, he had a low need for security. But even with that low need, it still wasn't being met. He wasn't getting the details that he needed. So he wasn't feeling psychologically safe. So it's pretty complex. It's not just you need to have your highest one met. You need to have all of them met to some extent. It just helps to know what's driving you. What's the lens you see the world through the most?
How they all connect.
Yes, and they definitely connect and they interact.
Okay. On that note, we've come to the end of our second segment. We are talking today with Dr. Dan Radecki, co-author of Psychological Safety, and we will be right back. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.